Hello, everyone. I'd like to tell you a story about a mule deer hunt, a Texas mule deer hunt, the famous West Texas. This is desert country, and I was fortunate to have been invited by Remington Ammunition to test out a new prototype bullet that they're going to be releasing. In fact, I think they're going to release it at the start of the SHOT Show this year. So it should be available for everyone to use next year. And it is called the CuT Bullet. Capital C, U, lowercase u, capital T. The CU stands for copper in the periodic table of elements. And the capital T stands for the polymer tip that they're going to put on it. So it's a polymer tipped hollow point nose, all copper bullet with some banding around the shank, kind of what everyone's coming out with these days. And it's now going to be available on Remington Ammunition. That is what I got to hunt with, but it was a prototype. So it might be a little bit different from what I was using, but I would guess it'd be pretty close to the same thing. And I said I was fortunate to get to go because, of course, Remington invited me down and hosted this hunt. And I was hunting for cull mule deer. This is not the one I shot, but that gives you a good idea of what we were after. So here's how things went down. I flew down to Midland, Texas, met up with the guys. Joel Hodgson was the PR manager for Remington who invited me. Just a great, intelligent, sharp young man. Really fun to hang out with and hunt with. And there are several other guys in camp. And the hunt was run by High West Outfitters. They've been running down there for some 20 plus years, and they've got a lot of really big ranches. And this is dramatic, huge country. They've got lots of buttes rising up and mountains along the border. We were pretty close to the Mexican border down there. We're getting into that Big Bend country. We could actually see the mountains of Big Bend National Park. And there's a sort of a Big Bend State Park down there too that was real close to this ranch. And they've got a lot of cactus, as you might imagine, but it's really stunning country, and it's a lot more heavily vegetated than one might think of for a desert. The most abundant plant was creosote bush, which they make creosote for treating wood railroad ties. When I was a kid, you had these black oily railroad ties treated with creosote, prevents rot. Nothing that I know of eats creosote bush. So these deer have to make a living on some of the other plants growing down there. And it's kind of amazing when you look at how harsh and open and gravelly this country is, and then covered up with that inedible creosote bush. You wonder what these deer eat to get these big antlers. But they find something because we were seeing some pretty good deer. Now, we stayed in an old ranch house. Still, the ranch is still being actively run, and it's all free range. There's no high fences here. I don't know how many acres it was. It was a long drive south of Marfa to get there, Marfa, Texas. And we started off early in the morning and we glassed. This is classic glass and stalk hunting. It was a little bit unfun for me because really to be efficient out here, you have to drive vast distances, go to a good spot and glass, drive to another spot and glass. And if you hiked, which is what I like to do, there's just not enough density of animals to really see very much. So on a short 3-day hunt, you really need to cover some ground. And we put on quite a few miles, but it was surprising how many deer we could see from each location. Occasionally we would not see anything within closer than a mile. And sometimes we would spot things out there at 2 miles. And then of course it's get over there, check them out and see if it was the one you wanted to shoot. Now, as I mentioned, I was hired to shoot a cull deer, which means a buck that was old, fully mature, but didn't quite have the antler conformation they would like to see. Now, whether or not this tactic actually works to improve deer populations is up for grabs. I don't think it does. Most of the recent research suggested it just can't happen. It's just too many variables out there, especially the does. Nonetheless, it does kind of make sense for these outfitters to take the deformed antlered bucks, if you want to call them that. And what we were mostly looking at were pretty wide and high, good mass, older bucks, and the antlers would have generally 3 points on a side rather than 4. They want that double bifurcation like you see on this rack. That's classic right there. Good forks, 4 to a side instead of 3. So we were looking for those 3-pointers. Now, there were a couple of guys in camp who were hunting for what we would call trophy bucks. And they had some good specimens of those too. And I am going to tell you about one that is absolutely a monster that one of the hunters got in the camp. But first, let's go on with how this hunt went down. So we got up early in the mornings, and it was cold that first morning. You think way down there near the Mexican border in South Texas, it would be pretty warm. I was looking forward to a little warmth, but I think it was colder down there than back home in Idaho. But you know what hunting is. You just put up with it, do your best. Joel was wearing everything he had, plus a few things he scrounged up, I think, with that first morning of glassing. But right away, we started finding pretty good bucks. And I was a little mystified because our guide, his name was Josh Coffey, a young man who was really good at his job already. This guy had a lot of talent at obviously finding deer, but he was just a great guide to be working with as far as his interpersonal relationships and stuff. He just really made you feel comfortable as a hunter. So no pressure there, but boy, was he good at finding deer. Of course, he's been at it now for 2 or 3 years down there at this ranch, and he knows what to look for. And he began pointing out good bucks really quickly. But what mystified me was we weren't going after them. He was like, "That's a nice buck. Let's go shoot him." Well, no, I've got to age him. And he was studying a lot of the features on a deer that suggest age. And it's not just antlers. You can't just really tell by the antler. You have to look at the face and the ears and the under the neck, the little wattle hanging down like an old man. And there's all sorts of things you look for in an older deer. As a result, we passed up quite a few deer. He saw some good 4-point bucks that had good deep forks. And he said, "No, those are trophies and or potential trophies. We're not taking those." So we just kept looking. And then we spent day after day doing this. And the deer did what deer usually do. They're out active in the morning. The rut wasn't quite on yet, but the bucks were starting to check out the does a little bit. So we would find groups of 4 to 8 does, and there'd be 1 or 2 bucks hanging around or cruising through. And that helped because it kept them walking longer than normal. But by mid-morning, they were generally bedded, and then it becomes extremely difficult to find those deer. So we're glassing a lot, both with binoculars and spotting scopes, and just scouring that countryside, trying to find some bucks. The bedded bucks often show up because of the glint off of their antlers. They can be pretty well hidden under the short brush, but those antlers stick up high enough, you find that glint, and then you've got yourself a deer. So we looked over quite a few that first day and didn't take any. And then the second day, same routine, only this time we picked up a pretty good buck and went hiking over some ridges to try to get a shot on him. And he was moving enough with these does that we could never really get the drop on him. Every time we'd pop into position for a shot, we'd see that he had moved another 200 or 300 yards and he was again out of range. And we were certainly capable of making these long shots. Joel was shooting a 27 Nosler and a Nosler bolt action rifle. I think it was a model 21. And of course, he had that thing dialed for some pretty long shots with a big scope on it. And still, he preferred to get a little bit closer. It was a little bit windy, and you don't want to be taking these long shots if you don't have to. So we continued to stalk closer and closer, lost that deer. Probably, I don't know, we just couldn't figure out where he had disappeared. So we went back to the truck into a new area. And as we were driving, there it was right off the side of the road in some heavy brush, just about to cross a sandy wash. And Joel bailed out of that truck, ran to the back and got into position and made a great shot on that buck, dumped him on his nose, and it ran up the draw ways. And yeah, I think he gave it another shot, and he had himself a good buck. And it was a 3x3, but good mass on it, just a nice mule deer that I think most of us would be happy to take. So here he was all set up with this new bullet and a long-range, big, powerful 27 Nosler cartridge, all set to take these 300 and 400-yard shots. And I think his was about 45 yards. He even joked about it when we got up on that deer. All that preparation for the long shot, and you get one right there. But, you know, ideally, that's what we want, to get as close as possible with these deer. And it was a beautiful buck, and he had his deer. And of course, he had offered it to me. You know, he said, "Hey, Ron, you want to shoot this deer that we were after, that we were stalking that morning?" And I told him, no, I mean, he had never gotten a nice mule deer like that. And of course, I had several. And I said, "No, you go ahead. I'm going to kind of look for a special one. And I just enjoy watching and filming you." And so we did. The next day was my turn. And we looked and looked and looked and as we were hunting, we got a call from one of the other guides saying, "Hey, you want to see a good deer?" I got my client one. This client was Scott Conway, who's a buyer for some sporting goods stores in the Midwest. And he was on, oh, he's been on several good mule deer hunts, but oh my gosh, he had never seen a deer like this one, let alone shot one. And nobody else in camp had either. This was the deer of a lifetime, of several lifetimes. We taped it 38 inches spread. That's inside spread and outside spread, because these antlers just kept going and going. They never curved in at all. So the outside spread and the inside spread are both the same measurement right out of the tips of the main beams. This deer was unbelievable. They had it in the back of the truck going back to the ranch when we bumped into them. And it almost hung over both sides of that pickup box. It was just crazy. What an incredible buck. And of course, all of us want to stumble onto a deer like that. If we can't find him using our smarts, just stumbling onto him would work. And that's essentially what happened here. The guide had never seen it before. It was the biggest mule deer out of Texas that this outfitter, I think, has ever taken. None of the guides had seen it before. No one knew it was there. It was just one of those serendipitous deals that pops up and you're just happy to be there. And I said to the other guys at dinner that night, I said, you realize how lucky we all are just to be in camp and see a freshly taken deer like that. How many of us have ever been in a hunting camp and seen a deer rack that spread 38 inches? And we roughed out a score on him at about 230 inches or so. So this was just a spectacular deer. And you just had to slap Scott on the back and give him all the credit for having gotten lucky and got into this deer. And he knew it was just sheer luck and was most appreciative of having had that luck. But I was still looking for my deer. And what happened on the last morning that we hunted is that once again, we're driving to new areas and glassing, and I saw the buck first, hot dog, coming out of a little swale bottom of thick stuff and moving up a ridge. And I said, well, what about that one? And once again, Josh put the spotting scope on him and sized him up, said, yeah, that looks like it's a doable deer. Let's run over there. So we got over there. The wind came up. It was pretty bad wind, the worst wind we'd had of the trip. And we worked our way into position, eased around. It finally spotted this buck bedded. And Josh said afterward, this is typically what happens early in the morning like that when we see a buck coming out of the bottoms where more water is and there's more to eat. They're usually done feeding and they're moving into a bedding site. And when you see them go over a rocky ridge like that, probably means he's going to bed on the other side. Josh sees that a lot. So a tip that you can use next time you're hunting mule deer out in western deserty country, when they pop over a ridge like that all by themselves, late in the morning, they're probably going to bed. So you want to look for them, and they often bed just over a ridge. So the wind sweeps over that ridge and brings the scent of any predators to them while they are lying, watching downwind for anything approaching for a visual confirmation. So when we relocated that animal, of course, we just moved into position. There's no sense in taking a 400-yard shot if you can get closer. And we were able to stalk and crawl up to a nice yucca bush with good cover and found a buck lying there about 155 yards away. Now, the cool thing was I was carrying my Borden Timberline 7mm Remington Magnum rifle. I used that on my elk this last year, and I've used it on several things over the years. And here was Joel with his 27 Nosler. I had never shot anything with a 27 Nosler. So I asked him if I could borrow it for this shot. Seems kind of silly to bring your rifle all the way down there and then use somebody else's, but I thought, when else am I going to get to shoot a 27 Nosler? So he graciously allowed me to do that. And then I got into position sitting, as I usually do, with my elbows in my knees for good steady support and my little cross sticks up underneath the rifle, and allowed a little bit for the wind howling. And of course, at 155 yards, dead on hold. But this buck was bedded and he'd seen us moving enough that he was looking right at us, but he wasn't alarmed. And I see this a lot with mule deer. They just don't get all that excited if you're very slow and cautious and they suspect something. It's almost like they think they're hiding well enough that they're not going to jump up and expose themselves. And that was the case here. He just lay there and watched and did not move. And I kept the sights on him and finally said, gee, Josh, I don't know. I think I'd probably just shoot him right there because I've got a nice neck shot, clean shot, and that range. Kind of hard to miss with an accurate rifle like this. But Josh thought he would try to get this deer up. Now, this might surprise you. Josh stood up. And I've done this before too. Figured that would get that buck up without overly alarming him so that he ran off. He did not get up. Josh waved his arms and that buck did not get up. Josh walked a few steps out into the clear and back and that buck did not get up. And I've seen this many, many times. They think they're so well hidden. They do not want to expose themselves and they will lie there like a rabbit and not get up. But when they do, if you try to push your luck on these deals, they'll jump up running and then you've got a running shot. And I didn't want that. So I just said, Josh, I'm just going to shoot him in the neck while he's lying there. And that's what I did. Tipped him right over. So we had a real nice buck. And again, a 3x3. I think 3 forking on the back, 2 forking here, 2 forking in the front, and then it was really unbalanced. But a good old buck. Josh really did a good job of picking out these old bucks for culls. So overall, it was just a great camp. Of course, the bullets worked fine. I mean, copper bullets these days are so well proven. They've been around for so long, and everyone seems to have figured out the recipe for these, and they're so accurate. Now, this new CuT Bullet from Remington has bands around it, real similar to the Hornady GMX or the new one, the CX from Hornady. Almost all these copper bullets now are going to these bands, relief bands, you could call them, or driving bands, but the effect is the same. It reduces the amount of copper that touches the bore, so you don't get as much pressure, you don't get as much copper fouling. And then they make the bullets long and sleek and put that sharp polymer tip on it, and you end up with as good a BC from the form factor as you can get. You are never going to get as high a BC out of an all copper bullet as a lead core bullet of the same weight, because you can't push that weight up in the copper without making the bullet so long that it won't stabilize in traditional rifling twists. So you're going to have a little bit lighter bullet, and that keeps the BC a little bit lower. But because it's a lighter bullet, you can drive it much more quickly, and that offsets a little bit of what you lose from not having the high BC. And out to 400 yards, I don't have any issues with the stuff. It works quite well. And obviously, these weren't anywhere near that distance for these shots. Even Scott shooting that great big massive buck, he took that thing at only about 150 yards or so. They had seen it at about 450 and they could see that they could stalk closer, and why not? And they did. He ends up getting within about 150, 170 yards of this animal and gets it. So everything worked just beautifully on that deal. So if you ever are interested in a desert mule deer hunt in Texas, I had never really thought about going. I'd seen some pictures and they're so bucks, and I'm living out in the West where I can hunt mule deer in places like Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho and Colorado, and why should I go all the way down to Texas? But for the late winter into December, in early January, hunting season, it's a great opportunity, and it's really some impressive country. I just love the looks of that place and the feel of it. It's so empty. No power lines, very few. I don't think we saw any buildings, power lines, or any sign of humanity other than the ranch we were on. And it was way back in there, way back in. I think we had to drive 2 miles on back roads just to get to the pavement, to drive another mile or two, another hour or two to get up to Marfa, and then head over to the airport in Midland. So it's a long drive out there. But classic cowboy country, classic mule deer country. They had aoudad running around out there, a few feral hogs. It's cougar country for sure. So if you want something different, take a look at that West Texas. And if you are a Remington fan and you like to try some copper bullets, Remington will have its own copper bullet out now called the CuT, C-U-T, Remington Tipped Copper Bullet. You might want to check it out. And wherever you decide to hunt this year, next year, or whenever, do hunt honest and shoot straight.